I'm Priscilla Barrera with the Investing News Network, and here with me today is Nicholas Garrett, CEO of RCS Global, and Harrison Mitchell, Director of RCS Global. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
So my first question is, as countries move away from fossil fuels to clean energy, it seems that this transition is not without other consequences for the environment and communities. Do you think the mining industry is moving in the right direction towards sustainable sourcing of raw materials, and will it reach that point soon enough?
Yeah, very interesting question. So we're obviously seeing a massive increase in demand for battery materials based on the increase from EVs, electric vehicles, and this is having a profound impact on supply chains worldwide. I would even say that I don't think we've seen the full consequences of this increase in demand yet. So we are seeing some areas where that demand is creating issues, so environmental impacts or community impacts. And what has happened as a result of this is that the downstream companies, the brands, the manufacturers have started to take interest in the concerns in those areas. Now that in turn is creating pressure on mining companies, as you say, to do something about it. Now the issue is that some mining companies are doing the right thing and paying attention and starting to get up to speed. Others are not. And so I think that we'll see over time a kind of division in the market between those mining companies that are doing the right thing and will be able to or be able to demonstrate that they have responsible sourcing practices, and those that are not. And that will have an impact, I think, on market demand for those companies.
Right. And we've seen that mining companies are falling under more scrutiny as a strong demand of EVs will also increase the need for raw materials significantly. How are companies currently adapting to this?
Yeah, so companies are doing this different ways. So in a way, we divide the supply chain into upstream and downstream. So from a downstream point of view, companies are looking at their risks. So they're looking at it from a risk point of view, and they're developing a set of frameworks or audits to understand that risk and their exposure to it. So you're seeing a lot of industry groups and individual leading companies reaching out down their supply chain to really understand. First of all, understand the supply chain. They don't even know in some cases what the supply chain looks like. And then secondly, once they do understand it, understand the risks and tell their suppliers that they need to meet certain minimum standards of production. From a mining company point of view, what's interesting is that the large-scale miners are finally waking up to realize that this is an issue that they have to deal with seriously. So you're seeing their industry groups as well, some of which we're working with actually, like the Cobalt Institute and the ICMM, which is the International Council for Mining and Metals, representing the very large-scale mines out there. They are starting to pick up and take an interest in this issue and develop essentially frameworks for their members to respond accordingly to the downstream pressure.
The key aspect here is that so far there's been a discernible trend that the downstream has invested a lot in standards and indicators developments, and that has led to a situation where the mining industry per se, without having developed their own indicators and frameworks, found itself in a position where it essentially had the terms dictated to it, even though it is quite a powerful industry as of itself. And there were obviously some concerns over whether those terms were always appropriate because they were obviously developed from a downstream perspective. So what we're seeing now is sort of the slightly the response by the mining industry to develop its own indicators and reporting frameworks to either align with or slightly have slightly more mining sector appropriate reporting indicators that they feel more comfortable with.
And what do you think will be the consequences or some of the consequences for companies that are not willing to commit to ethical sourcing of raw materials?
Yeah, so we had a situation about 10 years ago with so-called conflict minerals, right? 3TG, or tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. And what occurred at that point, maybe 7 years ago now, once a law came through in the United States called Dodd-Frank 1502, was a differentiation in the market, but not in the way that some people think in terms of a premium that was applied, but rather a discount. So the market then set a new standard for this is what is the minimum expectation in terms of production quality or responsible standards of sourcing, and everyone has to meet that. And if you don't meet that, it essentially gets heavily discounted. So I would suggest that the potential is there to do the same thing for battery materials. So if you are a producer, there will be essentially a requirement in due course of the market that you have to meet a certain standard, and if you don't meet that standard, you may well find yourself that having to sell at a discounted rate.
Yeah, the important part here is that very robust due diligence systems are being implemented by the players in the market that are committed to responsible sourcing, so that they can in turn ensure the integrity of their supply chain. In other words, that no material from players that are not adhering to responsible sourcing standards actually finds its way into the raw material supply chain.
Yeah, I think the other thing to say there is that it's really important for these producers to understand that it's not enough to say that you're doing the right thing. You're going to have to demonstrate it, right? I mean, that's very clear. When I talk to my brand customers or clients, they want to see the proof, right? So I think producers are going to have to wake up to the fact that they're going to need to demonstrate that they are producing in a responsible way.
And what initiatives is RCS working on to ensure metals for the EV market are sourced in a sustainable way?
So we have a few projects we're involved in that are quite interesting. So as I mentioned, we're working with some of the producer industry groups, so Cobalt Institute and ICMM, and that's to either understand the issue from their point of view, and how they should respond, or in the case of Cobalt Institute, to actually develop a framework for their members to apply, right? So they need a framework to actually apply and measure themselves against, so that they can demonstrate that compliance with their customers. So we're also working in the downstream side of things though as well. So one of our recent projects was with the Triple CMC, which is a Chinese manufacturing association, to develop due diligence and audit protocols for their members. And that's again very important because they sit in the middle of the supply chain. China is a huge part of the battery supply chain as a refiner and sourcer of material, and so they needed to demonstrate to their downstream customers, which include the brands, that they are getting up to speed. So we're also working with individual companies. Maybe Nick, you want to say something there?
Yeah, we're working with individual mining companies in the upstream. These are industrial mining companies, like, for example, ERG, and we work with them on mitigating their risk exposure to a whole number of risks, including risks that are emanating from artisanal and small-scale mining that might be happening around their concession. These are not companies that actually have those materials in their supply chain, but they obviously still face some reputational risks from these activities happening in the same area where they're operating. We're also working on an exciting project that is called the Better Sourcing Program, which is essentially implements due diligence standards in the upstream and provides assurance for both industrial and artisanally produced material. Through the implementation of the Better Sourcing Program, there is the potential to unlock responsible artisanal sources and allow them access to a responsible market. And over and above that, we obviously conduct a number of site assessments and verifications, etc., to help downstream companies understand their risks in the upstream.
Yeah, I think the final point there, just to say, is one of our major pieces of work is with the ICT industry. So we work in information technology and electronics. So we work with them, and one of our clients has been mapping their supply chain from start to finish in all the battery supply chains, really just to understand, because the first step of any of this is to understand what the supply chain looks like. And many of these customers of ours or clients of ours find that the first point of conversation is, I can't even get past my first tier of suppliers, right? So that's some of the work that we do is helping them reach down and truly understand what's going on in their supply chain.
All right, and my last question. If there are any other steps that should the industry take to ensure raw materials such as cobalt, lithium, and nickel are sourced ethically?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, I think some of these industry groups are paying attention and taking this seriously. I would say that cobalt obviously has been in the news, and so therefore taking it is kind of a first mover at this point. We're not seeing the same reaction at the moment from the other two, lithium and nickel, but I would suggest that, we've done a report recently that you've got over there, and you can view it on battery.rcsglobal.com. That report shows that in all those other supply chains of nickel, manganese, and lithium, there are risks, and there are concerns about what will happen if the demand increases. It's going to place pressure on local communities, on the environment. And so those brands that are at the very end of the supply chain are going to be very concerned with that kind of thing. So I think it is important that the industry groups pay attention.
Yeah, I think the other thing to mention is that the concept of due diligence itself means that as a company, you're guilty until proven innocent. And it is your responsibility to prove that you're innocent, and therefore you need to invest in robust management systems. You need to invest in chain of custody systems if you're operating in a high-risk jurisdictions, and you need to make the outcomes and the results of the due diligence system available to the public so that you can credibly demonstrate that you're complying with good practice and market expectations around responsible sourcing.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
A pleasure. Thank you for having us.